things that I wanted to ask you about too was the use of archetypes, because I've used personality, both personality traits and personality disorders, a lot in my work. I find that they're useful in certain concepts. I have different opinions about certain personality instruments that we don't need to go into. But you've talked about archetypes and you use that heavily in your book, that I think is a really interesting way of looking at that kind of flow between dark and light, the intersections, commonalities, and differences of it. So what do you think the value is in talking about the personality versus archetypes and focusing on archetypes?
Absolutely. So I love archetypes because for those who are unfamiliar, archetypes are patterns of behavior that exist within individuals and also in the collective that are fluid and dynamic and creative and almost, archetypes can really be thought of as like characters. And within all of us, there are all of these characters that are constantly engaging with each other and helping each other and pushing each other down. And so, in this sense, the journey of self understanding becomes much more dynamic and creative and playful rather than what is arguably the reigning paradigm of self understanding, which is in this. I am this, I am not that. I am an introvert, not an extrovert. I am a thinker or I'm a feeler, and people can get really stuck in these sort of binary labels of I am this or I am that. And sorry, my cat's coming up to play here. And, especially for the highly creative individual who already has a highly dynamic personality, these binary labels just don't feel right because who they are and how they engage with the world is often highly dependent on what they're doing, who they're with, the time of day, their mood. And so I know for myself personally, the idea of assigning myself with introvert or extrovert can feel so silly when it's so dependent on my
Mhm.
environment and how I'm feeling. And so, what archetypes allow for is more of a fluidity and a dynamism when it relates to self understanding. So, I use 10 archetypes in my book, Wired This Way, that are based on the tendencies of the creative high potential individual. So, things like openness to experience and passion and achievement orientation. And each of these archetypes has a light side and a dark side. And that's not to say it has a good side and a bad side, but rather it has two halves of a whole. And so by working with these archetypes, we can really begin to understand ourselves as these living, breathing, ever changing, dynamic personalities. What archetypes also do is they give a shared language for teams that can be a lot less
Yeah.
threatening. So, if you're working with a team, if you're a chief of staff or you're someone in HR, you're just a leader, you may want to deliver a criticism or share feedback, and you may not really want to use some of the existing language around just pointing out people's flaws, but by using the archetypes, you're allowed to kind of package this feedback into a more creative modality that may be less threatening. It also allows everyone to understand. So when I say I am the sensitive creator today, everybody knows what that means, right? Because we all understand what the light and the dark of this archetype is, assuming you've worked with the
Yeah,
archetypes.
I like what you're saying about that fluidity too, because I've seen workshops where there's those color-based personality ones, and then people go and separate themselves onto different tables, and there's four colors, and everyone sits at a different table, and we go, okay, we're at the orange table, so we're all the same, and we know kind of what's good about us, and then we know what's wrong with the blue people, which is
Yes.
really, really rigid thinking that I don't think is necessarily productive in that, because you don't want to just automatically separate people into four different opposing teams based on certain trends maybe in their behavior. And it's
Yes.
also, I think those models aren't great for understanding other people because when you have that really rigid thinking about someone else's personality, it's harder to be compassionate or empathetic about when they're struggling or when they're really doing well or understanding how to communicate with them, right?
Absolutely. And, by looking at the archetypes, you can also, it's so funny. When I wrote the book, I just assumed that people would understand that we are all 10 of the archetypes. We all have all 10 of the archetypes within us. And I found that people's instinct was to want to say, oh, I'm this one, right? Like to pick one, because
Mm,
there is this, we do have a craving to kind of self-diagnose or self-identify, but that's maybe the easier way, but that's not maybe the most helpful way, because the truth is you can learn a lot more by saying, by examining the way that, say, my sensitive creator and my charming creator, these two archetypes, how they interact with each other, rather than saying I'm just an introvert or an extrovert. Because, for example, my sensitive creator, which is the part of me that's, maybe overwhelmed in crowds, the way it interacts with my charming creator, which is also the side of me that's very gregarious and social and good at sales, and the way those two interact can be much more informative, than just saying I'm this or I'm that, because it allows you to really understand it based on the situation and the environment. So it just allows really for this customization, that, I mean, of course, the journey of self discovery should feel customized. I mean, how silly is it to think that someone has created a system where we're going to be just one set of things from a list? That's so boring.
yeah, yeah. And it's funny when you're talking about development too, because there are some fairly stable patterns of behavior, but there's all sorts of stuff you can change, right? If you're looking at moving into different roles, whether it's work or family or among friends or whatever, it's interesting to see where that kind of flexibility or fluidity is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.